Where are my working mamas at? For various reasons, a lot of moms find themselves working full-time, part-time, online, work from home, or work away from home. No matter what your work situation is, as a mom, I'm sure you've felt some challenges. In this episode of the Daily Wellness Podcast, we dive into the struggles of achieving a work-life balance as a mom. We know there's never a perfect balance, right? But I think you'll feel encouraged by my chat with Christi. She's a mental health therapist and working mom coach who shares her personal journey of navigating motherhood while pursuing a fulfilling career. She helps us discover practical strategies for managing stress, setting boundaries, getting in quality family time, overcoming mom guilt, and more. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by the demands of parenting and work, this episode is for you. Welcome to the Daily Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Meredith. I've led my family on a transformative health journey for over a decade, and now I help other families do the same. This is a place where busy moms can learn about healthy living. I hope that what you learn here helps you feel empowered to take the next step in your family's health journey. Hi, Christi. Thank you for joining me on the Daily Wellness Podcast.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, we're going to talk about work-life balance mainly. I mean, you helping moms have that healthy balance in their life. And so can you kind of share your story of you building your career and then becoming a mom and how that's worked out for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is that I am a mental health therapist. I'm licensed in New York State. And so when I got out of graduate school, I got my first job at a community mental health agency in a therapist role. And I was doing that for a while. I was at the agency for probably, 8-ish years, something like that. And during that time, I was doing what pretty much everybody does at the start of their career. I was doing the thing. I was going to work every day, trying to advance, trying to, continue to move forward. And so while I was there, I was doing, I worked in different programs. I worked in different positions. I was doing therapy for a while. I was doing management for a while. I had a good relationship with my boss. I was traveling. I was doing all sorts of things. And then probably about 7 years after I started there is when I had my daughter, my first of 2 kids. And suddenly everything just became very, very hard. Suddenly being on call, for example, something that's always a little bit stressful suddenly became very stressful. And traveling, something that I always sort of enjoyed, again, suddenly became very stressful. And so it was this whole, it added this whole layer to things that just made things very, very hard. And so eventually I just realized that things needed to change. Certain things just weren't working anymore. And so that's when I decided to leave the agency. I went into private practice. And things were still hard then. Then we dealt with COVID and everything else. And eventually, I decided to switch gears, not entirely, but just sort of shift more to this coaching position, this coaching role, so that I could really just focus on helping other moms with careers who were having a lot of similar kinds of challenges.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. And so do you feel like what was kind of you said it was hard, like what exactly was hard about that?
I mean, honestly, there were so many things. I think a big part of it was that because I was a first-time mom, there were a lot of things that I didn't know, a lot of things that nobody told me, a lot of things that I wasn't prepared for. So for example, one thing that I really struggled with was returning to work. As much as I loved my job, as much as I loved my career, I struggled with putting my daughter in daycare and having to go back at the end of my maternity leave. And I ran into some challenges when I maybe tried to get it extended. That didn't work out the way that I had hoped. So when I went back to work, I wasn't feeling entirely ready. I was exclusively pumping. So suddenly I was trying to fit pumping breaks into my day, finding privacy, stepping out of meetings, doing all of those sorts of things. And then just the one thing that I feel like I really was not prepared for was just how often kids get sick. So suddenly dealing with all of these unexpected things, having to drop everything, and and deal with those kinds of things. And I just feel like, well, I guess one of the first things that you realize as a mom, I guess people don't really tell you is just how much is actually outside of your control. And that is something that you have to learn very, very quickly.
Yeah, that's true. I think if we're just kind of thinking through the timeline, like that initial, you're done with maternity leave, you just build this like incredible bond with your new baby. And then you have these greater times of separation as you go back to work. And a lot of moms experience a lot of guilt because of that. I mean, I think even if you're not going back to work, like there's always mom guilt in this parenting journey for something or other. How did you kind of deal with that? I mean, that separation and feeling kind of guilty about not being with her as much.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. I agree with what you said. I feel like this mom guilt is just something that is so present. And that was hard for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons that I think it was especially hard for me is because I grew up in a family. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. Other women in my family had been stay-at-home moms. I was really the first one in my immediate family circle to go back to work and use daycare. And so that in itself felt really hard. And then on top of that, I ended up being gone a lot longer for my day than I really expected. So I was commuting 45 minutes to work. And so sometimes I would drop my daughter off at, 7 o'clock in the morning to be at work by 8. I wasn't home until, maybe 5 or 5:30 at night. And then the other thing that I wasn't really expecting was I didn't know newborn sleep schedule. She would go to bed so early. She would go to bed by like 6 o'clock at night, and we weren't getting home till 5:30. And so that was really hard. And so when you ask about guilt, well, I mean, I experienced it just like everybody else, but then I had to really sort of work on, it was a situation that I couldn't really control. I could control some things. I was able to start working through my lunch so I could get home 30 minutes earlier, things like that, which aren't necessarily the greatest, but it was really more about working on the mindset shift. So, for example, I mentioned not having as much time with her during the day. And so as much as I would have liked my sleep, I also started to really appreciate the time that I had with her during the night, because that was our time together. That became our time together. So just sort of focusing on, realizing certain things are out of my control. I'm not doing anything wrong, focusing on all the reasons why this was good for our family, and then just trying to like appreciate the positive things so that I could kind of accept that situation. Also knowing that the situation is temporary. I mean, babies, kids, they go through all these stages, the good, the bad, everything is temporary. And so just sort of reminding myself of that too.
Yeah, true. Did you ever have a moment where you considered doing just one? I mean, at some point where you were like, should I go back to work? Should I just be a mom? Like, should I maybe not have kids and focus on my career? Like, did you ever have that process?
Yeah. I don't think the thought ever crossed my mind of not having kids. I think that was something that I always knew that I wanted. Mm-hmm. But yes, I mean, there was a time, especially during my maternity leave, when I'll be honest, I was not crazy about the idea of going back to work. There was a time when I was having a conversation with my husband and asking, like, is this something that I really have to do? I really, really struggled with that. And he empathized, he felt for me, but ultimately the message that he gave me and the conclusion that we came to was that, like, yeah, I needed to go back to work. And looking back, it ended up being a really good thing because daycare ended up being such a great thing. I really feel like returning to work was the right choice for me and for our family. It was just really hard for me to see it at the time, especially when I was dealing with all those other emotional challenges of going back to work.
Yeah. You kind of mentioned like that daycare was a good thing. Do you think that was a big piece in kind of giving you peace about returning to work? So, like knowing that your kid was in a good situation that you felt really good about?
Honestly, I don't think at that time I saw daycare as a good thing. I think at the beginning, It felt like something that I had to do. Probably the very first day that I dropped my daughter off at daycare, and probably for the first, I don't even remember, probably several weeks at least, I really, really struggled. I had such a hard time dropping her off, so that was just something that I really didn't see at the time. But now, I mean, I have so much, I give so much credit to stay-at-home moms. I know they have their hands full with their own set of challenges. It was not something that I think would have ever been a good fit for me, and looking back, I know that about myself. And I see how my daughter thrived, and we ended up having a really positive experience at our daycare. So, I mean, we feel very fortunate about that. But yeah, it was something that hindsight is 2020.
Yeah. And how far are your kids?
So they're 4 years. They're 4 years apart.
Okay.
And so
Right.
they both have birthdays coming up next month. So she will be 9 and he will be 5.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing so openly about some of the struggles that you went through. 'Cause I know a lot of mamas can relate to that. And so can you kind of walk us through what the process of creating like some, I don't know, some systems in your life to manage your time or your home life better, or boundaries that you put into your life to kind of make everything work? Can you kind of talk us through some of those practical things that you feel like have really made the difference for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for starters, one thing that I want to mention is that there has been a lot of change with that as the years have gone on, because
That makes sense.
as life changes, our needs change. And quite frankly, we were in a very unique situation where our son, my second child, he was born at the very, very, very start of COVID. Like, the world was shutting down and I was in the hospital. So we were adjusting to that. And that in itself, I had to make some major changes to my schedule where, I mentioned that I'm a therapist. And so we had to make changes to our schedule where I was doing sessions at night because I couldn't rely on daycare to stay open, because they were constantly shutting down from exposures and things like that. But obviously that's a unique situation. But the point is, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that we have to be flexible and we have to be opening to adapt as our lives change. And so now, yes, I feel like we have some pretty good systems in place. I have, like, my kids are in school, which is great. And then I just have to sort of have I have my work hours, I have my home hours. I adjust as needed because things come up unexpectedly, but I really try to stick to those. I try my best to have good boundaries with those, just because it is important. It is important to make sure that you're prioritizing that time so that you're not losing that time.
Yeah. Do you feel like you've had to say no to some things in your life so that you could still have your career and be there for your family?
I mean, I feel like no is something that we all kind of have to say. It can be really hard at times. But yeah, I mean, so for example, I had mentioned before that one of the big things that happened is that when my daughter was born, I mean, I stayed in my agency job for about another year or so, but then I ended up having to leave. And one of the big reasons for that was because I found it increasingly hard to travel. That was I was in a management role at the time. That position required more and more travel. And so that was something that I didn't really feel like I could say no to, but I also didn't feel good saying yes, knowing that I was like leaving my young child at home, And so I guess in that sense, just this idea of like, no, I can't keep working here, and that was, I mean, I could have, but it was a choice that I made because of what I wanted to prioritize at that time in my life.
Yeah, I think that's smart. I think that for any of us moms, we need to be able to know what our best yeses are, and know when to say no. Like, we literally can't do everything. That's one of the things about social media. Sometimes it appears like we're doing everything and everything is great. But, in the background of my life, personally, there's a lot that I say no to so that I can say yes to the things that are really most important to me, because if you say yes to everything, then your calendar is overloaded, you're mentally overloaded, you're extremely stressed out, and you can't really give your best to anything. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think social media, I mean, since you mentioned it, I mean, I think there can be some good things about it in the sense that I do think sometimes we can get support in other mom communities and things like that. But generally speaking, I think that social media can just create so many challenges for moms because, to your point, it shows this like curated, like made up picture of what other moms' lives are, what they look like. And that is, I think, even though most of us sort of know that that's what's going on, it's still really hard not to compare ourselves. And then, that can the comparison can really, make it hard for us, for all moms, I think.
Yeah. Do you ever kind of coach some of your clients to maybe find a different job that might be a better fit for them? I mean, that's kind of part of your story is you're still a therapist, but you left that community-based therapy to do your own private practice. So is that kind of part of the coaching sometimes, is to find a place in a position that's a better fit for you and your lifestyle?
So to that, I would say yes and no. I would never tell somebody that they should or should not lose their job or leave their job. I feel like that is a very personal choice.
Yeah.
And what feels right for one person isn't going to feel right for another person. What I do, however, is I do help them sort of explore their priorities, explore their values, and I help sort of guide them through that process. And I help them sort of ask themselves the questions about, is this a right fit for me? And does it make sense to stay? Does it make sense to leave? What does that look like? So that ultimately, whatever decision they can make, hopefully they can be more accepting of that decision, even with the challenges that might come along with it. But ultimately feel more confident in that decision that they make.
Right. Do you feel like stress is kind of a big factor for moms that are trying to pursue a career and stay connected to their families?
Yes. Oh my gosh. I feel like stress is always there. It's like such a big thing as working moms, especially all moms really, but as working moms, especially I feel like we are just juggling so many things. We've got multiple roles, and a lot of times we don't feel like we have the support that we necessarily want. I think that there are a lot of expectations that we sort of feel the weight of coming from society. I think that there are some messages and like expectations that we've been conditioned to sort of believe. And then because of those, we get those expectations from other people in our lives too. And then I think a lot of times we put those expectations on ourselves. And so, to kind of do all the things, prioritize everybody else, be everything to everybody all the time. And to do everything, not just to do everything, but to do everything well. And it can be a really, really high bar that's being set for us. And that can be incredibly stressful for so many people.
Yeah. I mean, we talk a lot about health and wellness stuff in this podcast. So, I mean, stress is a big contributor to disease. So what kind of stress management tools do you use personally or encourage your clients to use?
Yeah. So for starters, I will say that all the things that I talk to my clients about are things that I also use personally with myself. And so in a very general sense, I talk to people about this in two different ways. So I talk about specific stress management strategies, things like self-care and relaxation and, getting good sleep and time management and all of those kinds of things. But the other big piece is I really do a lot of work with people and help them to understand like their mindset patterns so that they can have more of an awareness of, what things are really important to them, what sorts of things can they delegate, what sorts of things can they say no to. I help them with the mindset piece so that maybe they feel okay with saying no to certain things, putting boundaries into place, like all of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I like that your suggestions kind of cover different areas because stress can be different, right? You can have like the physical stress of just a demanding life where you're kind of running around, and especially if you have active kids in the evenings and things like that after work, or stress can be mental, right? Where it's just like that mental overload of your to-do list and things that you're trying to not forget about.
Yeah.
And then it could also be like if you're not really taking that self-care seriously and prioritizing your health, then you could have the stress of that your body is just experiencing on a cellular level, of not being cared for properly. So I like that your suggestions really kind of cover those different areas.
Yeah. Well, and again, like I think that everybody's lives are different and what people's stressors are different and what their needs are different. And
Right.
so, but all of these things I think are things that that can be helpful. And it's just sort of about finding the things that really work for each person,
Right.
because again, we want to have realistic expectations, for ourselves and the things that we are doing. So for me personally, one of the things that I really try to prioritize is I do my best. It's hard with little kids who don't sleep well, but I try to prioritize my sleep. I try to make sure, even if I have other things I still need to do, there's a certain point where I'm like, you know what? This can wait until tomorrow. This doesn't have to be done right now. Like, I am going to bed. Another thing that I feel like has always been really important to me, before I had kids, is I really loved exercising, being super active. Once I had kids, that became really, really hard, to the point where for years it felt like non-existent. And now I'm at a point where I do have it back in my life, but it doesn't look the way that it used to look. I might be, going to the gym 2 times a week because maybe that's what I feel like I can handle. But it's still really helpful and important in terms of being able to manage that stress. And I'm prioritizing it because it's important, but I'm also managing the expectations of like what I'm actually able to do.
Yeah. And it kind of goes back to what you explained earlier about being flexible and knowing what season of life you're in, and what you can and can't do, and being willing to change.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a perfect example. Your workout life pre-motherhood does not need to look the same post-motherhood. It can still be effective and wonderful, but look very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that is a bit of a challenge for a lot of people, is shifting the expectations. Because at the end of the day, when things don't go the way that we expect them to, that is when we tend to struggle more emotionally. That's when we tend to be harder on ourselves. That's when we tend to be, feel more guilty or feel more like frustrated or whatever it might be. And so really sort of getting a clear idea of, setting good goals, but also setting goals that feel realistic and managing our expectations around that.
Yeah. What are some of the kind of long-term effects that you have seen in your clients of women that maybe aren't handling their stress well, aren't setting good boundaries, aren't setting, appropriate for their season of life goals? Like, what are some of the negative things that are happening because of the lack of those other things?
Yeah, well, so for starters, when we don't take good care of ourselves, when we experience a lot of stress, so one of the biggest things that we need to be concerned about is this potential for burnout, and people, I think, a lot of times use those terms interchangeably, but they are different. Whereas stress tends to be more situational, it's more short term, once the stressor itself is resolved, a lot of times the stress goes away. Whereas with burnout, it's more of a result of like chronic ongoing stress that isn't being properly managed or resolved. And so once we get to that point, that's when we can start to experience things like, this chronic exhaustion. And when I talk about that, I mean exhaustion that doesn't just go away with a good night's sleep. It doesn't just go away with a nap. We tend to be more cynical. We tend to feel more negative. We don't enjoy the things that we used to enjoy as much, like all of those kinds of things. But then also along with that, we might have a harder time coping with situations. We might have a harder time, we might be more irritable. We might be less patient. And so that unfortunately then spills over into our relationships, where maybe we are, having a harder time being patient with our kids just because we're having a hard time managing our own emotions. And so that's one of the things that I really like to focus on with my coaching, is essentially how do we take care of ourselves? And along with that, how do we sort of preserve and improve our relationships with our families, because they're important too.
Yeah, that's so good. I love that. How can women kind of connect with you and your resources? Can you kind of share like what you're offering in your coaching program so that women who feel like they need some help know what your resources are?
Yeah, of course. So for starters, the first thing that I want to invite everybody to do is to join. I have a free Facebook group. It's called Thrive as a Career-Driven Mom, and it's free. And I go on there, every Wednesday, and I do these, short training videos, just covering a lot of different topics to sort of give people some quick tips, quick pointers, like things like that, things to think about. And so that's something that people could do more immediately. But then I also have the coaching program, which is all of that and more, right? So all of these things that we're talking about today, everything from, exploring our values, learning strategies, for managing like our time and delegating and taking care of ourselves, setting boundaries, all of that. And then the other major part of that is I teach them about the mindset, right? So how to recognize, how to understand our thought patterns, how to shift those thought patterns, basically how to take control of the things that maybe we don't feel like are within our control. And so that people can also find through the Facebook group, but also I have a website. It's called Christi Gmyr Coaching, so they can find me there too.
Okay, awesome. I love that you're offering that because I feel like if you're in a place of where you're overwhelmed, it's hard to know even like what questions to ask yourself or where to start, and to have someone kind of just get you started on the process is so helpful. So I love that you're doing that for mamas. We'll put all of that information in the show notes so that people can connect with you. Is there anything else really on your heart that you would love to share with working moms out there?
Yeah, I think I would just like to say, I want everybody to just kind of remember, no matter what's going on, just remember that you're doing a great job. Being a mom parenting is so, so hard. And I think a lot of times we're in situations where we're kind of questioning our decisions. We don't think we're doing everything right, but there is not just one right way to be a mom. There are lots of right ways to be a mom. And so just keep in mind, we're all doing the best we can. And I really believe that as long as we are, thinking about what's best for ourselves, thinking about what's best for our families and making decisions based on that, again, like you're all doing a great job.
I love that. Thank you for that encouragement. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. I'm so excited for moms to connect to your resources. Thank you for offering the free Facebook group as a first step. I think that's amazing. I really appreciate you.
Well, thank you so much again for having me. I'm so glad that I was able to be here and talk with you today.
Thanks for listening to today's episode on the Daily Wellness Podcast. We hope that you found it helpful for your own wellness journey. And if so, we'd love for you to leave a review. Then come back and listen for review shoutouts on upcoming episodes. For more information, check out the show notes and connect with us on our website, dailywellnesscommunity.com.